You're here with the Black Anglo-Saxon, back with another episode of The Eavesdrop.
This is Inquisitive Q, and today we have a special guest with us.
I am aka Quan the Poet, aka the Educated O-Dog.
Hey, first off, I'm gonna just clown for 1 second.
Go ahead.
Why you got two big names?
That's fine.
I like the Educated O-Dog. It made me think of, what's that movie? Minister Society.
Yeah.
Because that's one of my favorite movies.
So yeah, he
O-Dog.
gets shot, but after that he go to college and stuff, get his life right. And voila.
But today we're going to be talking about toxic hope. Back here behind me, if you can see the board, it's just denial, coping mechanisms, toxic ambition, fence straddling, and accountability is what we'll be going through today. And so I wanted to start the conversation with the denial piece around, how we continue to have hope as we see the situations, worsen in front of us, as we watch everything from the coronavirus, our political systems, wealth calcification, and just the myriad of issues that we are dealing with as a nation. And I want to talk about denial, one, to touch on how people are handling it, one, with the coronavirus, and people refusing to take heed, I guess, to the economic implications as well as the possible health implications surrounding the issue, and seeing people retreat into this stance of it's just not real. The data isn't necessarily in my favor, so I'm not going to take any logical means to approach the situation, whether I want to say it's a man-made disease or not. But then I'll let you two speak to some things that you are seeing as it relates to denial, how denial has become a part of our culture in a sense as Black Americans, as we use it as a coping mechanism to get out of certain situations. And I want to before I let you go, bring up just the portion of it around jokes and how people use jokes, just as one example before we get into it, and how people use that to kind of suppress the situation. So go ahead.
I live in denial like it's a river in Africa. I do. But with that said, gallows humor or dark humor, I've learned and experienced that, especially in diasporas, whether you have the Jewish diaspora, whether you have the African or Irish diaspora, that people use humor as a coping mechanism to begin to understand what it is that they really have to process emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
So you read a political article that I sent with the expertise and everything else. We'll drop it down in the description below what we're talking about. That said, COVID-19 or the coronavirus is one of those pandemics that's going to shape and reshape our entire life, from the political landscape to the cultural landscape, but I'll focus on the cultural landscape with the jokes. The memes just shows experts how powerful social media really is and how you have to take it very serious that people are going to make jokes on the internet and they want to spread misinformation and disinformation with these jokes. And the jokes undermine the severity of the situation. And that's when we come in and we're talking about the accountability. And a lot of people deny that they can be accountable for someone else's, what happens to someone else. And we see it in our interpersonal relationships, especially the romantic ones. But right now, COVID-19 is going to show people, especially individuals, that individualism is going to fall because not everything is funny. And not everything is funny because members of the community are affected by what you think is just a joke.
Yeah. And to that point, I'm going to speak to it from another perspective, because like we have a situation where we are killing people for the individual aspect of how we operate. Mm-hmm. But I asked the question, where do we get it from?
I wouldn't say there's primarily a source as much as it's part of human behavior.
Where do we? And I'll ask you to be more specific and say what in particular.
So for me, what I'm getting at is that in America, there's a history of us always making decisions in every aspect, political wise, business wise.
Mm-hmm.
Every decision was always made for the here and now, despite what would happen in the future. So you have things where there were clear implications of how it would impact the future,
Mm-hmm.
but we collectively said, F it, let's do it. And now the future is now, and everyone's now looking at these people or these kids, knowing good and well that those decisions that were made back in those times were just as selfish, if not more selfish, than the decisions that these kids that we're killing them for doing. So I don't necessarily look at, for example, the kids partying while the COVID is out there. I look at that with the same amount of callousness that their parents did when they signed the NAFTA agreement that took away the jobs that they would potentially have.
That's a false comparison for me.
And so my question would be then, are you saying who taught us to act in a manner in that we don't necessarily process the future in our decision making?
Exactly. Because again, were decisions made in the same way that we asking these younger people to make these decisions? Were we thinking about the future in a way when we were making all of these deals with all of these countries, shipping and I get it, it can be conceived as a false parallel, but I'm looking at it from an aggregate, because when you look at, let's take boomers versus every other millennial Gen X. When you look at them at every age, they out-wealth us at damn near every age.
But where's in terms of related back to me for denial, in terms of the conversation of us as a group, Black Americans at large, being in denial and how it's affecting society.
We're in denial because our decision-making process as a collective has always been screw everybody else. I'm doing this for me. So we cannot then get mad at anybody who says to this, screw y'all, I'm doing this for me. That's the American way.
So that leads me into the next point that I have in terms of coping mechanisms being passed down. You speak about, the culture of Americans in general, across the spectrum, being relentless in a way where we prioritize individualism. And Quentin also spoke to what that being one of the pillars that will fall in terms of this coronavirus coming and shifting a lot of different cultural things in how we approach America. And so in those coping mechanisms, I just want to go over, some other coping mechanisms that I see. And I heard you bring up meme culture as well. And meme culture is something that I've always, had an issue with, because it undermines and because it doesn't have the full depth and range of the conversation at hand. Me particularly, I don't necessarily mind jokes per se about any issue. As you know, me personally, I'll joke about religion, I'll joke about a lot of different things. But when we have an issue that we are living through and going through at the moment, I think that there has to be a certain level of presence there in terms of addressing the issue that requires me or us to not be in a mode where we're joking about the situation, whether it be to ease anxiety or not. Because in having worked in crisis situations, you know that you have to be alert, you have to be nimble, you have to be very, very precise, because in going to the event or in approaching the event, your solutions in terms of fixing it may change depending on the scale of the event, or just a bunch of different variables that I don't think people actually give credence to. And so that the relentlessness, the individualism, I think are all coping mechanisms of existing in a society that has a model, in a model of exploiting people in terms of its labor, in terms of you being able to get access. So we see come out of that is the rugged individualism. And to your point, I agree that people are taught it in a very subversive way, but part of what has to happen is people have to start acting out the values that they say they have. Because what happens is it's one thing to, put your fist up in light of Malcolm X or, whatever civil rights leader that you champion. But at the same time, if you're not professing and acting in those values, as well as understanding those values to the full context, along with the pros and cons that go along with how you're identifying yourself or how you're navigating, you have to be very aware.
Yes.
And so you can't just joke about certain things. And when to reframe kind of how you're using the word relentless, the acronym, I say acronym. I done lost the word. But basically, the modifier that I want to or would like to use is it's a gluttony, it's an insatiable desire to kind of just consume, because I don't think it's just in terms of our labor relations and how people don't necessarily care about each other. And I see it play out in a lot of different ways. And I'll just throw it your way to kind of get your take on it in terms of the coping mechanisms.
You know why I'm smiling, son. I'm smiling because, and again, for me, I always see that there is an element of humor, but the problem is that in American culture, humor is so slapstick that it doesn't necessarily elevate, and not necessarily class-wise, but elevate itself to the depth of, people are buying toilet paper the same way doctors during the plague were selling fake goods. It's like you can make a joke because people during pandemics exploit people who panic. That's a true thing.
Resale, sneaker resale.
That's a true thing. Scarcity. People profit off scarcity. But I'm laughing because the coping mechanism that I have seen within my interpersonal relationships, especially on the romantic side, is that people use other people to cope. And I've come to the understanding that some people cling to life and some people cling to other people. And those who cling to life are the ones who do take crises seriously, because they have to look at the constraints of living. They have to look at, if I don't do this, then this doesn't get done. They have to put in the effort. But what's falling down in the community with the coping mechanisms, it's like, I'm not poor. I don't have to worry about it. I don't have diabetes. I don't have chronic heart disease. I'm not in my 40s and above. I'm not this, because I'm not in the same predicament as other people. I am safe. And that's the false narrative that people feed themselves when they begin to cope with narratives, instead of looking at the science, looking at what the doctors and the experts are saying. It's like, no, just because you're young doesn't mean it won't affect you. Just because you take every precaution that you think you can take, doesn't mean it won't affect you. This is a virus. A virus doesn't have the same cognitive biases that we have, nor does a virus have the same quote unquote human tether or unit cohesion that we can show during this time. And the coping mechanisms are so bad in interpersonal relationships on a romantic level. And I bring that up because if you can't necessarily keep your promises to one person, how can you keep your promises to a community?
Or I'll just interrupt you for 1 second.
Go ahead.
And go a step further. If you can't keep promises to yourself, because a lot of the times people don't love themselves or treat themselves with a certain level of respect. And we see it play out in terms of how people may set a goal and may not stick to that goal or find any other reason to, deter themselves from that goal. And you see, like you said, then it turns into a cycle of coping mechanisms where you'll have a person who is now, because you feel bad because you didn't do that goal, now I'm going to go to happy hour to make myself feel better about that. And then I have now it just matriculates into a series of goals. But I see you, go ahead.
And like to piggyback off that point, I feel like the memes are like a form of protest almost. Some of them. Because I feel like when you look at some memes, some of them speak to a condition, some of them speak to a frustration, and some of them speak to unfleshed out points or unfleshed out like biases. When you really look at those memes and take the time to really dissect and dive in. So when you speak about coping mechanisms and you speak on a people that really don't have the means to express themselves, like how we can sit here and bounce ideas around and this, that, and the third, their only form of protest or their only means of showing some type of intellect or some type of input might be to post a meme that might be funny that gets at the establishment.
But I'm gonna push back on that
bring you
for
back
1
for a
second.
second.
Go ahead.
No, I'll let you go first, because I'm not gonna forget.
Because what I want to address is it's not their only means to actually protest. What you're talking about is a person not wanting to put in the diligence to be able to protest in a way that it matters.
True.
Memes and telling a joke and taking a soundbite basically in a visual image and attaching it to an issue doesn't necessarily work. And I'll give you an example where it doesn't. So, the Trump memes have been gold, right?
Oh, yeah.
Everybody loves the Trump memes. I saw one where Trump basically was the larger image, and basically the illustration was saying to us that Trump reignited the KKK and put the battery in the KKK's back to bring it energy. And that is historically and contextually wrong. Even though I understand where they were trying to get at in terms of the relationship between the ideologies, what it does is it tells people and it gives them a false narrative and how the hierarchy works. The KKK is more of a lobbying group in the sense that it funds a person like Trump. So to be correct in terms of how it's mechanized, you have to reverse that image. That's the problem with memes, is that they leave out a lot of the context that's necessary to have certain robust conversations. Certain conversations require a certain level of depth. Like another example is, I don't even care for how we do candidate forums during our election cycles, because if you're asking a person a question about re-engineering a whole society, like a quote unquote Bernie Sanders, or a person who is speaking about extensive policy solutions, I need to give you more than 2 minutes and 5 minutes to speak. Yeah, there are different formats, but a lot of people use that one as its main. And so I want to create the parallel between memes being, there's a place for memes, but memes should not be the primary source of how people are expressing their intellect.
I got you. Can I jump in now?
Absolutely.
Cool. I'm going back because I'm being petty today. That's the macro. That's the larger community. I'm going to take it real back down to the micro. I'm going to take it back down to the interpersonal, because what I hear from you is that some people just don't feel like they can be vulnerable enough to say what it is, to express what they really feel, whereas we're in a space where we could do that. I'm going to turn that off now.
Is it time?
No, it just turned on by itself. It's a short, a wire somewhere. But bloopers. I'll go back and do it again. So what I hear from you is that people don't feel vulnerable enough in social media to express themselves like we're expressing ourselves now. And what I hear from you is that some conversations really require you to pull back the layers to really see what's there. And again, I bring it back to the interpersonal and the romantic because people are willing to risk their lives and their health being with a person that they're not willing to be emotionally vulnerable with. So you have the physical intimacy, but there's no emotional intimacy. There's no real understanding or common ground between two parties, one person and another person. I'm not labeling love. Love is love. But the conversation about coping is that one or both parties are using each other to cope with things that they don't want to face in their life. The same way both communities, because the internet is really about communities use their memes to cope with whatever stresses that are going on in their life. Now when we look at Trump, we got to look at the Trump, and then we got to look at the other memes about our relationships to one another. Yeah. So for me, it's pretty hard to ask a civic leader to make a decision for a community in which you can barely find any staples of the community, like families, in one place, in one household. That sounds really conservative, but okay, whatever. Families in one place, in one household. If they're not in one place, in one household, families where you have enough of a communication network in which you can help understand what's going to be decided for the child. So when it comes down to the coping mechanisms and the memes, it goes back to the toxicity. I really hate that because people make it a catch-all. It goes back to people's unwillingness to be vulnerable enough to say, this is the real problem that I'm having. This is the real emotion that I'm having. This is what I really want to be resolved. And coming to the table and understanding that in any good compromise, no one's freaking happy. Everyone goes away a little upset, but no one is left out. And we don't have that I don't have that in my interpersonal relationships. I don't see too many in other people interpersonal relationships. So I really struggle to see how people will understand the importance of community. And I'll end with this one. That's where I believe the intergenerational conversation is important, because older people are willing to tell you what you think is going to happen is not what's going to happen. And when your feelings are hurt, don't come talk to me.
And perfect segue, because in terms of talking about people being vulnerable, people being in a space where they're feeling this emotion, they have this stance, but they don't openly take that stance because they aren't vulnerable or they aren't willing to express the pain that may be behind the quote unquote bravery, the passion, and all of those things that, exactly, that people would like people to have to, be seen in a certain light. And that leads me to, talk about toxic ambition, because I'll say, and I'll speak for myself, in terms of growing up in an environment where, everybody is groomed to have a hustler's mentality, right? And so you do everything that is necessary to get yourself out of, predicaments, because the predicaments come time and again. So you develop this insatiable appetite to kind of just continue to go work, but we don't talk about the mental lacerations, some of the physical ailments that come along with that. And even in you talking about what's even possible in terms of having that intergenerational discussion and saying, I want to start a business, or I want to do this, and you not necessarily having necessary pieces and components to, propel you and to actually undergird you in going on whatever endeavor that you're going on. And so I think our generation, millennials, the secure the bag culture, I think is really, really, really toxic, because even when, I hear a lot of us, talk about wanting to be CEOs and wanting to be, a boss, and a lot of these different things that take up a lot of mental space, a lot of physical energy, but aren't willing to work 18 hours, aren't willing to say, I can't have that drink, aren't willing to say, I can't joke right now. I can't make it about the memes right now, because to put it in context with everything that's going on in the world, is like, look, we don't really have time to joke. Everybody, likes to say, we can walk and chew bubblegum, but I've yet to see it. The society is plunging in a myriad of ways as we speak. And so just doing things out of, pure gluttony, like we were talking about earlier in terms of that relentlessness to just say, I'm going to just get the money and not understand or cry about, Donald Trump doing what he's doing at the border, but then also saying, I don't care if Wayfair gets the contracts to do that, I'm still going to buy at Wayfair. Or you want to have and you want to separate your values from your behaviors essentially. And that doesn't work. And so it's on both ends in terms of, us taking some of the brunt, but then also, parents pushing their kids to a brink of, relentlessness without having that understanding of what it's doing to the kids. Even when you talk about kids who quote unquote overperform, that have a lot of stress and anxiety for all of the, burden that their parents put on them to sometimes compete with each other amongst the parent class. But then also because they understand that the world is highly competitive in this way that it breeds depression, that it breeds all of these illnesses, that it breeds a lot of the toxicity that we see in terms of, me taking steps to quote unquote win and play this game, and picking a girl based on how she looks because that gets you extra points, or a girl seeking to look a certain way because it gets you extra points. And
Rousseau, Hobbes, Locke, and the political things about fair straddling, accountability. It all comes into education, character development. We have to understand, going back to the GDP and health, that the state of nature that they all discuss is outside of human control. And the reason we come together is so that we may survive what nature may throw at us, that we couldn't survive as individuals, we can't survive as a collective. So it's no longer about exploiting the health of the people of the natural persons that comprise the persons or the companies and the firms that give us the products